So in ancient Western Africa, there was a form of money called agribeads, which you guys may have read about in the Bitcoin standard. This was a small glass bead money that was used for centuries in Western Africa. And when European explorers appeared in Africa in the 16th century, it was quickly apparent to them that these small glass beads were very valuable to locals. So since glassmaking tech was primitive in Africa, agribeads were reliably scarce to other goods and services, which gave them a monetary property that supported their value in the marketplace. Back in Europe, however, glassmaking tech was much more sophisticated, and counterfeit glass beads virtually identical to agribeads could be mass-produced at a low cost. Seizing this economic opportunity, many crafty Europeans soon began arranging expeditions from Western Africa, shipping in huge quantities of indistinguishably counterfeit agribeads into Africa. These were basically just counterfeit beads fashioned back in Europe that they shipped into Africa. So as European ships arrived on African shores, many holes packed full of glass beads, locals readily traded their hard-earned assets for these counterfeit glass beads. And later, agribeads would become known as slave beads, because as these newly impoverished African locals became desperate, some of them were forced to sell themselves or others into slavery as a result. So agribeads became known as slave beads, which were one of history's many monetary systems weaponized by counterfeiters, because they were instrumental in the multi-century transatlantic slave trade. So the transatlantic slave trade was a 365-year atrocity. Over 12.5 million lives were directly confiscated from African shores and sent to Europe and America. Over 2 million of these people died in transit, and this does not consider all their children born into slavery, issues we're still suffering from today. And so kind of in a barbaric irony of history, some of the same ships that came to African shores packed with glass beads, hulls packed with glass beads, left with hulls packed with slaves. Masters of slave ships packed their hulls tightly with slaves in an inhumane and unforgivingly precise way. And unfortunately, agribeads were not the only isolated episode of counterfeit money leading to slavery. Another form of money called panos was a cloth strip money used in ancient Western Africa. Lured by a virtually limitless profit potential, Portuguese panos producers soon established a state-sponsored monopoly, which mandated the use of its warehousing and trading post operations for all financial flows denominated in panos. This monopoly enforced the use of panos for tax payments, to forcibly denominate slave trade contracts, and to hire soldiers. And to name just one similar non-coincidental example today, the US government enforces the use of dollars for tax collections as legal tender, as the nominal currency for all oil contracts worldwide, and as the international reserve currency. So the point of this is that when free market forces are manipulated, producers gain an asymmetric ability to set prices without regard to customer preferences, thereby converting an economic democracy, like a free market, into a dictatorship, and freedom into tyranny. So for money, this implies that monopolists can acquire human time, aka labor, in the marketplace at an unfair price. Said differently, money monopolists can steal human time. This is a malevolent power that effectively makes them slave masters. So said simply, an exclusive right to produce money without regard for competitive market pressures is an apparatus of enslavement. It's a vile privilege that monopolists can only preserve through deception and violence. This dynamic forms a vicious cycle in which monopolists become de facto currency counterfeiters that monopolize money production and tax collection, use cheaply produced money to buy assets and hire soldiers. After impoverishing their trading partners with the cheaply produced money, they would conquer or enslave them. Then they would use those slaves to work in their money production facilities or other labor units, and then they will forcibly protect that monopoly violently by suppressing competition, and so on and so forth. So it's a really vicious, ugly cycle. So those are two old examples of how counterfeit money leads to slavery. And to quantify the transatlantic slave trade from an economic perspective, to compare it to today, not counting the children that were born into slavery, assuming that every slave could labor for 5,000 hours each year for 40 years, the total time stolen comes to a staggering 2.5 trillion hours over 365 years. That's 6.8 billion hours stolen per year for 365 years straight. So in a first principles sense, counterfeiting money is time theft, and time theft is enslavement. This is no joke. So systems of stealing human time, whether they are direct or indirect, can hardly be called anything other than slavery. And since money is redeemable for human time, Those who violently monopolize its production are engaging in a form of slavery by stealing time incrementally from the users of money through counterfeiting operations.